There is way too much going on.
Yeah.
Way too much. Way too much happening.
I'm trying to figure out where the best place to exist is in this fight.
Some things fly across the screen, and I'm like, is that a projectile or no?
What the is going on?
What? What happened to the vacuum? I hope we got protection plan on that.
Something is hitting me from below, and I just can't even. There's so much overload.
Okay, it's very hard to see what's going on.
Ah! Oh my God. See, I just don't see it.
Okay.
I just can't.
It's all right. It's all
I
right.
don't have 7 eyes.
Here's a real high-class bout. And begin!
And the only flying shoot-'em-up boss in the DLC, High-Noon Hoopla pits us against an outlaw cow named Esther Winchester. High-Noon Hoopla attempts the impossible, cramming 4 phases into a boss less than 2 minutes in length. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't quite get away with it. With so many phases in such a short time, we end up with a lot of ideas and mechanics, none of which are ever fully explored. Not only is the unifying Western outlaw theme abandoned halfway through, but this unifying theme almost never translates to solid mechanics. The most prominent reason to replay High-Noon Hoopla is not for its depth or satisfaction in mechanics, or for its clever use of screen space, or even to improve and master what should be a fair challenge. No, the main reason to replay High-Noon Hoopla is to see the cow turn into sausages. That moment is narratively unexpected, hilarious, and a perfect use of surrealism, but by no means does it justify butchering the Western theme, and it certainly doesn't justify abandoning learning points, failing to establish a core mechanic, or being a generally confusing mess. For this video, we'll be doing a phase-by-phase breakdown. Phase 1's best descriptor is unhinged visual chaos, with all of the complexity and none of the depth to back it up. It reeks of lost potential, visual clutter, trial and error, shallowness, telegraphing issues, and a weak attempt at establishing a core mechanic that's abandoned before it's even set up. Phase 2 is overall sufficient for what it is. Esther's vacuum serves multiple purposes very well and leads the charge in the second best phase in High-Noon Hoopla. Unfortunately, any solid mechanics established in Phase 2 get the boot in Phase 3. Phase 2 feels like a half to a whole. The mechanics and skills set up in Phase 2 are dropped in Phase 3, rendering Phase 2 disconnected and incoherent in light of the whole fight. Phase 3 begins the new food-centric theme. While it's funny and hectic, Phase 3 ultimately fails to establish depth or engaging scenarios. Contributing to this overall shallowness, one of the Phase's 3 hostile game elements doesn't actually do anything, and with only 2 other elements which don't interact, Phase 3 devolves into transition phase levels of tedium. Lastly, Phase 4 follows the ideal structure and gameplay for a final phase. The phase isn't too complicated, it doesn't introduce entirely new mechanics at the end of the fight, and it leverages its small number of game elements to great effect. Phase 4 is the light in the dark cave, and as usual, we have to trudge through the rest of this mess to get there. Hi, I'm Sean Kays, and welcome to Design Frame, home of the Game Design Case Study. Phase 1. Wow. Phase 1. Phase 1. Phase 1 is a mess. The best way I can describe Phase 1 is chaotic, unfocused, confusing, and an overall visual blunder. It is an assault on the eyes, not because it looks bad, but because it's just so dang diddly busy. There's too much going on all the time, and there's no real visual hierarchy that sets each game element apart. The background bleeds into the foreground. Similarly colored game elements blend together. Projectiles are always getting lost in the clutter. It's a mess. So let's explore this problem.
I'm trying to figure out where the best place to exist is in this fight.
Man. There's so much. There's so much.
Some things fly across the screen, and I'm like, is that a projectile or no?
Who knows?
We'll start with the elephant in the room. The issue most players would consider is High-Noon Hoopla's most apparent fault: visual chaos. Where does it come from? The visual clarity in Phase 1 sucks, but big but here, the art itself, while it does contribute, is not the root cause of Phase 1's visual clarity issues. No, the root cause of Phase 1's issues starts with our game term, complexity. As a short recap from the previous Cuphead video in this series, link in the description and at the end of this video, complexity is the culmination of unique game elements with which a player interacts and or unique actions a player takes. Complexity represents all of the building blocks that are put together to make a game. A challenge with many game elements has high complexity, while a challenge with few game elements has low complexity. If we look at all of the hostile game elements in Phase 1 of High-Noon Hoopla, Esther herself, the lasso and cactus, the flying horses which shoot spiky balls, the vulture which drops a dynamite bundle which then turns into a bunch of dynamite sticks, and the snake oil which flies forwards, backwards, then forwards again, as well as each of their telegraphs and the visual obstruction of both Esther's wanted poster and the occasional cactus. Well, we've got a complex phase here, don't we, fellas? With so much complexity jammed into one single phase, it's no wonder that visual clarity suffers. The lack of visual clarity results from too much complexity. At times, I'm not sure if I'm playing a video game or looking at a Jackson Pollock painting. Each game element is presented in such a haphazard way, just thrown together, that it's difficult to tell what Studio MDHR were going for. So, we've established that Phase 1 is too complex. There are too many game elements, and all of these overlapping elements cause visual confusion. But it's not just the number of game elements at fault, it's their presentation as well.
Okay, all right. I glazed over. I had that thing happen where you're watching too many things at once and your eyes like fully glazed over. That's what just happened to me.
Okay, pay attention to everything. The dynamite explodes into 4 What hit me?
There are 3 presentation issues. The first presentation problem comes from the on-screen position of attacks and their telegraphs. Because of the number of game elements, the player has a ton of stuff to track, and because all of those game elements originate from different directions on screen, the player must pay attention to every direction. While this could be an interesting core skill if the rest of the phase were designed around it, it comes across in High-Noon Hoopla as unintentional, and therefore haphazard. Let's look at the individual attacks to see where on screen they come from and how that can overwhelm the player. When Esther shoots the snake oil, the player must watch the close right screen to trace the attack's path from right to left. Once the projectiles reach middle screen, one or both of them will arc up or down and return the way they came, moving left to right from middle screen to far right screen. After that, the projectiles change direction again and slither back from the far right screen to the far left screen. So not only do the projectiles change direction multiple times, they do so at differing elevations. The lasso cactus attack telegraphs on the right, but originates from the left, causing the player to potentially focus on the wrong element. The player may look at the big, visually contrasting lasso instead of the entirely opposite direction. The vulture flies in from the upper left screen, drops dynamite from top middle, which then falls vertically and once it hits the ground, explodes into a 2-staged fanning projectile, originating from bottom screen. Finally, small horseflies appear anywhere from right screen, fly from right to left, then fire projectiles at the player from left screen. The horseflies in particular blend into the chaos because they're small, they don't have high visual contrast with the background, and they'll normally fire their projectile when close to the player, since the player usually hangs out on left screen.
Stop. Oh, what hit me?
Oh, there's already so much going on.
Oh, I didn't even see. Was there something pink coming at me? I don't know what's happening. Something is hitting me from below and I just can't even. There's so much overload. Visual overload.
Each attack consists of many pieces, directions, elevations, speeds, sometimes even multiple attacks condensed into one, but they're individually manageable. Altogether though, combined into one phase, well, there's a crap ton of moving parts coming from every which way, all of which demand the player's attention. Again, if this were the intent, watching every direction of the screen could be a cool core skill, but since that core skill is unsupported by depth and largely abandoned by the third phase, it seems unintentional. The second presentation problem is confusion between the background and foreground. I've alluded to this a couple times now, but what it boils down to is that the watercolor background image is too prominent. It's too hard to unfocus the eye and not see it. As a result, Esther's attacks can easily get lost in the background because it has a similar saturation level as the foreground, way too many colors, and way too many hard outlines. The visual language of the background is too similar to the visual language of the foreground. Objects in the foreground don't contrast enough with objects in the background. Add to this, the background is also constantly moving, and we get visual chaos. There's also this really cool perspective and parallax effect where the farther back in the background you look, the lower the level of detail, the less saturated the colors, the softer the object outlines, and the slower it moves. Unfortunately, what this does is create a gradient from background to foreground, when what we want is stark contrast. We don't want a gradual change from background to foreground, but that's what the gradient does. The result being that the near background, the road, rocks, and cacti, all stand out too much. The third presentation problem is the addition of visual obstructions to an already cluttered phase. Visual obstructions are objects which don't have hitboxes, but which do take up visual real estate. The most prominent of these are the lasso and the wanted poster, but the fourth wall cacti factor in as well. And this is a shame because these details are neat. When Esther sticks her arm out the window of the saloon, her wanted poster flies off into the wind. Most players probably won't notice this fantastic detail because their attention is split a million ways. If they do notice, they'll probably only perceive a white object flying across the screen and may even try to dodge it, thinking it's a projectile. Why? Because the wanted poster flies across the foreground into the player on an already overly cluttered screen. Similarly, the lasso is meant to be a helpful telegraph and really does a great job of expressing get out of the way, but mostly what it does is add to the confusion. It's lost in the chaos due to the previous two presentation problems. Objects that exist to create visual clutter, therefore to increase the difficulty, should not be placed on top of what is already a visual nightmare. As is, these cool details and flavor only contribute to the chaos, even if a visual obstruction like the lasso serves a telegraphing purpose. When dealing with this unmitigated chaos, what might otherwise be great details, telegraphs, or thematic aids instead become the very chaos they're laid on top of.
This is a fantastic looking level, don't get me wrong. I literally just wish there was a little contrast.
Yeah, no, so when you're in the bullet hell, the contrast is key. We're trying to get things done.
Overall, every time I lost health during phase 1, it was because I simply did not notice an attack due to the visual overload. It's too much from all directions simultaneously. While one might argue that identifying objects is a learned skill, so me missing projectiles is a skill issue and not a design issue, I will say, if Studio MDHR truly intended identifying objects to be a skill, it should have been implemented as such, with key learning points and interaction between game elements and narrative and thematic integration. In other words, support the mechanic. As it is, the visual chaos creates unfair situations where players are punished, not for failure to maneuver Cuphead, but because they could not see.
Way too much. Way too much happening. Oh my god. See, I just don't see it.
There is way too much going on.
Yeah.
What the f is going on?
Oh, yo, alright, this? Wow, okay. There is far more than I expected to be on screen right now.
God, there's so much to pay attention to here, man. No, not the cactus!
Oh my god. Okay, it's very hard to see what's going on. Ah! Oh my god, there's stuff behind me as well.
Okay. Wow, there's a lot happening with it. This is just a very busy one.
There is a lot going on.
We have a lot of
Oh shoot, I didn't see that.
Oh man, there's a lot going on here. Holy.
There's a lot happening on screen here.
Yeah! I gotta...
Alright.
Okay.
I just can't.
It's alright.
I don't have 7 eyes.
Compare Cuphead's art style and projectiles to a game series like Touhou, or really any bullet hell type game. Touhou is chaotic, but what sets it apart from Cuphead, aside from its genre and a lot of other things, is its design language. Visually, the game is built around the chaos. It uses simplification and abstraction to represent attacks as simple shapes. These simple shapes are combined into attack patterns, which are themselves simple shapes. Each attack pattern differs from other attack patterns, making it easy for the player to recognize and react. At the push of a button, the player may also slow their movement speed for precise control. When the player does this, their hitbox is drawn in-game, giving the player exact understanding of the situation. Touhou understands that pattern recognition and precision are primary focuses of the game, and so it prioritizes the visual clarity required to achieve that gameplay. Cuphead obviously is not a bullet hell game, and comparing it to one might seem silly, but that's the point. Phase 1 tries to act like a bullet hell game, but Cuphead's design philosophy and art style conflict with that misguided goal.
Okay, you know, I get that these are bullet hells. There's a little too much going on some of these screens. I think they went a little too ham.
Evidently, there's more frames of animation in this island than there is in the entire game for everything else.
I think they may have gone a little too overboard.
As a shoot-'em-up run-and-gun style game, Cuphead is a cousin to the bullet hell genre, and even shares similar aspects with Touhou, like the ability to shrink your plane similar to Touhou's precision mode, but it's just not the same. Cuphead's design philosophy and art style limitations restrict the number of attacks on screen to 2 or at most 3. The scale of the on-screen objects is too large to fit much more, the level of detail too great, and the pleasing color palettes only have so much space for super high contrast colors. This leaves very little space for extra projectiles compared to a game like Touhou. As many problems as Cuphead's bosses have, the game usually works around the limitations of its art style very well. High-Noon Hoopla is an exception. So let's look at how the base game handled multiple projectiles. The base game almost never had issues with visual clarity, in part due to the subtle background art, but also because each base game boss appears to follow strict rules on the number of attacks or objects on screen at once. The number of attacks on screen at any given time is kept to 2 for the overwhelming majority of the game. Very rarely are there 3 attacks on screen, let alone 4. From a design perspective, this is incredibly limiting. With only 2 or 3 unique attacks on screen at once, that doesn't leave us much room for interacting game elements. But that's the curse of simplicity. Simple is hard to do well. Without lots of game elements to mess around with, each individual game element has to be perfect because it can't blend into the crowd. Elements that don't pull their weight become pointless and disjunct. And that's the key with simple. Do more with less. Have game elements do more than one thing. Multi-purpose elements is how we can leverage simplicity to create satisfying depth, despite having very few elements to work with. Even Dr. Call's robot, one of the most chaotic base game bosses, follows this rule. Dr. Call's robot's first phase restricts itself to 3 attacks at once, keeping the fight both fair and manageable. But how does Dr. Call's attack management differ from Esther's, despite having a similarly high number of attacks? Just like Dr. Call's Phase 1, Esther's Phase 1 also throws out 3 attacks at once out of a possible 4. But the way Esther handles its 3 attacks compared to Dr. Call's robot differs in 3 key ways: direction, telegraphs, and complexity. Just like Esther in her saloon, Dr. Call's robot spins the entire phase on the right side of the screen. But unlike Esther, Dr. Call's robot uses its position on screen as a base of attack, rather than simply where the player is supposed to shoot. The robot's attacks come from the robot. Overall, the robot only has 2 directions from which attacks originate. The primary right screen location where the robot stands, with simple variations of top right, middle right, and bottom right, as well as the secondary left screen location where emerge the magnet and robot arms. Esther's lasso cactus also emerges from the left, but they are treated differently. The left screen exceptions are treated with care because they are exceptions. With Dr. Call's robot, Studio MDHR recognized that tons of hostile game elements all at once should be organized in a way the player can track, and if they aren't easily trackable, should not be immediately punishing. The robot arms arrive from left screen, but only after peeking out and pausing first, to clearly convey the attack from the direction the attack originates. The magnet also appears at left screen and does so relatively quickly, but because it doesn't deal damage, it's not immediately punishing like Esther's cactus. The appearance of the magnet means the player must express a skill to avoid damage, as opposed to the cactus's be in the wrong half of the screen, take damage. Dr. Call's left screen attacks are properly treated as exceptions and not the rule. This helps to create a cohesive and manageable challenge. Esther, on the other hand, uses attacks from every possible direction with seemingly no rhyme or reason. Dr. Call's telegraphs convey their attacks very clearly. Most attacks emerge slowly from the robot's hatches, so the player has plenty of time to intuitively learn and process what's going on. The robot's laser doesn't emerge from a hatch, but it does certainly convey "move out of the general vicinity" with a bright yellow targeting line and a very distinct sound effect. The robot arms, one of the two exceptions to the right screen attack origin, emerge from left screen, but then wait over a whole second before extending outward. Additionally, the hands do not have a hitbox until after the lengthy telegraph. And there's also a distinct sound effect in the left audio channel. Dr. Call's telegraphs are insanely intuitive and fair. Esther's telegraphs, on the other hand, are a mixed bag. Some are very clear, and some aren't. For instance, the telegraphs of both the Lasso Cactus and the Vulture Dynamite appear on the opposite side of the screen from the actual attack origin. The Cactus's telegraph begins from the far right side, but the damaging attacks pulls in from the left. And the Dynamite drops from the very top, but most of its impact comes from the bottom. These are misleading telegraphs, maybe even intentionally so, but let's break that down. What does a misleading telegraph mean? A misleading telegraph pulls attention away from the actual attack, making it more likely a player will get hit as opposed to less likely. The telegraph functions less as a warning of an incoming attack and more like a hostile game element itself. Even though misleading telegraphs are, well, misleading, they could be an engaging feature of an attack if used sparingly. For instance, Esther's Lasso and Dynamite are only lightly misleading and could be great if properly implemented and accommodated. However, if mishandled, misleading telegraphs can easily overburden a player and can even result in the player taking unfair damage. But worse than that, if the misleading telegraph is intentionally designed to trick the player, then the designer has just created a gotcha moment. Gotchas are misleading telegraphs with malice, or otherwise untelegraphed elements designed to waste a player's time.
Just move around. They're very slow projectiles. It's not even a huge problem. Oh my god.
And the gotcha moments are terrible for several reasons, but one of the main reasons is that a gotcha only works once. The gotcha getches you, then it never getches you again, because you remember for the next time. But that's not gameplay. A gotcha doesn't increase stakes or require a higher level of skill expression or require critical thinking or planning or anything gamey. A gotcha just happens. And then it's over, and the player is punished for the simple reason that they did not know about it. And how could they? A gotcha serves no gameplay function, especially in a mastery-based game. But let's give Studio MDHR the benefit of the doubt. Despite the several examples from the base game, we'll assume they did not intentionally create punishing game elements that punish players for simply existing. Even then, Esther's Vulture is pretty darn close. And even though Studio MDHR didn't intend malice or to waste the player's time, the mystery of how the gotcha Vulture made it into the game in the first place is arguably just as bad. Our first encounter with the Vulture comprises the Vulture flying at us out of nowhere. If the player happens to be sitting in the top left, the Vulture swoops in and gotcha! The Vulture's telegraph is heavily misleading at best because the Vulture's telegraph does not exist. There are no visual or audio cues prior to the attack. The only thing that could be considered a telegraph is the Vulture leaving, I guess insinuating that he'll be back. Casually leaving does not a telegraph make, and with Esther's visual chaos, the player almost certainly forgets about it until gotcha. But okay, Flip side, one might downplay how bad a misleading telegraph is by flipping my argument around. If a gotcha only works once, then it's only bad the first time the player gets got. Well, if it has no gameplay implications past the first challenge attempt, why does it exist at all? If its only purpose is to punish a player on the first attempt, it offers nothing to subsequent attempts. And if subsequent attempts are where the player spends the most time, then it's not a relevant game element. It's not worth the screen space tax. Similarly, the horseflies also fly under the radar. Their spiky ball telegraph is contained mostly within the horsefly silhouette, meaning it gets lost under all the other busyness. And with no sound effect, the horsefly projectiles are extremely difficult to notice and can be pretty unfair when fired close to the player.
To the second stage, and it looks like there were 4 stages total. What did I just get hit by?
Oh, God.
Oh, what hit me?
Oh, I didn't even see. Was there something pink coming at me? Something is hitting me from below.
And the parries, I barely see them joints. I see them, like, but it's too late. When I finally see the parries, it's too late to parry them.
Comparing Esther's misleading telegraphs to Dr. Call's is night and day. You may be asking, if Dr. Call's robot and Esther have the same number of phase 1 attacks, why is the robot's complexity good, but Esther's is too high? The answer to that question requires some terminology clarification. Complexity is the culmination of all unique game elements in a challenge. A game element is anything the player interacts with or does. In thinking about complexity and game elements, you might be tempted to call each enemy attack its own unique element, but this is not necessarily the case. It's possible, well, in most games probable, that one attack involves several game elements. As an example, think about a typical enemy from Software's Dark Souls. A simple sword strike may seem like one unique game element, but there are actually a ton of elements that go into it. There's the visual telegraph, the audio telegraph, and the hitbox. These are the usual elements that a Cuphead attack has. But then there's also the parry window, the attack recovery time, attack chains, and the hidden poise meter. There's tons of unique elements that all exist in relation to this attack. Cuphead is, thankfully for my video editing sanity, a bit simpler. Looking at Dr. Call's robot, we can see this in action. Each one of Dr. Call's attacks contains few unique game elements, and each of the elements are fairly straightforward. His laser fires in a straight line after telegraphing, so it's composed of the usual 3 elements, visual and audio telegraphs as well as a straight line hitbox. The wall drone has a visual telegraph and a straight line hitbox again, but it can be parried, so that's 3 unique elements. The most complex attack is the homing bomb because it has 2 hitboxes, it moves, and it's destructible. Breaking it down, that's one moving hitbox which follows the player. Then, since the bomb is destructible, it has its own health. And lastly, once that health is depleted, the bomb explodes into a second larger hitbox. However, this attack's relatively high complexity is balanced by its low difficulty. It's easy for the player to avoid this projectile since it moves slowly, and its destructibility actually helps the player by allowing them to permanently destroy it and control where the explosion takes place. Overall, the robot employs great variety in attacks, but each attack is slow and simple, and of course, only 3 at a time. When we look at Esther, on the other hand, we see the same number of attacks, but much greater complexity. In fact, 3 out of 4 of her attacks contain multiple unique hitboxes, making them tantamount to multiple attacks. Both the horseflies and the vulture have their own hitboxes and can harm the player, but then both the horseflies and vulture fire projectiles on top of that. The vulture's dynamite is especially complex because it first falls from top screen to bottom, which is its own hitbox path, and then once it hits the ground, it explodes into a fanning projectile, which explodes twice. Between the vulture hitbox, the falling dynamite, and the 2 fanning projectiles, which we'll call one attack, that's 3 separate attacks presented as one single attack. The snake oil is just as bad. The snake oil launches 2 projectiles, which normally wouldn't be unique game elements since they're identical, except that each projectile can move in a different path, and each of those paths is variable. Add to that, the path is complex. The projectile first quickly moves forward, then backward, then forward again, and both projectiles move independently. They don't follow a simple, easily identifiable path or shape like Touhou simple shapes. While in the context of a bullet hell game, this might not seem like much, but Cuphead is not a bullet hell game, and when compared to the bosses which don't suffer these issues, it's way too much. Studio MDHR definitely broke their own rule here, using way too many attacks in a single stage, and the boss suffers for it. From this comparison, you can clearly see the disparity between two bosses which both throw out 3 attacks at once. Dr. Cole's robot from the base game's IL-3, and Esther from the DLC. Oh, but wait a second. Clearly, the IL-3 robot boss is nowhere near the same difficulty and complexity as IL-4's Cowgirl, but do you remember what Studio MDHR said in my first Cuphead DLC video?
As far as the difficulty goes, we just did our best to balance it to around that World 3 kind of level of difficulty.
Oh, yeah.
Like, there's still a learning curve, but it's not technically harder than the original game.
Yeah.
Except for maybe the final boss on New Game Plus might be the hardest that's been out there.
Whoops. What happened there, partner? Dr. Call is a boss with many simple attacks well managed in both telegraphing and attack origin, whereas Esther is a boss with many complex attacks with questionable telegraphing at best and changes in directional patterns. It almost feels like Studio MDHR just kept adding unrelated game elements until they reached an arbitrary difficulty quota, then called it a day. Alright, now that the visual chaos elephant is put down, let's move on. With all of these unique game elements, you might be wondering what Studio MDHR was trying to accomplish in Phase 1. They must have needed all these game elements for a reason. Maybe in order to create interwoven mechanics built on a core skill, or maybe to create a unifying theme that pulls all the elements together under one narrative roof. So let's explore that question. Why did they make all these game elements? Let's first check if there's a core mechanic. A core mechanic is one which, ideally, all the game elements relate to and interact with. A core mechanic is a great place to start when figuring out why there's so many game elements, because if there is a core mechanic and it's used properly, then all of the many game elements should exist to support that mechanic. It should be obvious why the game elements exist. You can think of a core mechanic as the centerpiece of a holiday dinner. The turkey is the essential core of the whole meal, and the cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, and stuffing all exist to complement that core. If you're weird, you might eat just cranberry sauce on its own, but it's really there to serve the centerpiece. Which brings up another important point. You wouldn't eat cranberry sauce on its own, or at least I wouldn't, just like you probably wouldn't eat stuffing on its own. But if you take away the turkey, that's exactly what you're doing. Same goes for our game elements and core mechanic. If there is no core mechanic, you're left with a bunch of disparate game elements. They don't relate to each other, and they don't form a bigger picture. If we're unable to find a core mechanic for Esther, that's a problem even worse than too much complexity, because it means that there wasn't even a goal for all those elements. There was no intent in the game design. Looking at all the many and various game elements, it's hard to piece together what the core mechanic was supposed to be. The projectiles are too distinct and don't require similar skills to avoid. The mixture of destructible targets with non-destructible doesn't really make sense or suggest a larger strategy. And there's no overarching pattern to any of the attacks, unless you start counting out the timing between them, or if you consider Esther go up, Esther go down a pattern. But counting out attack timing is kind of a lame way to play Cuphead, and the pattern 1-2-1-2 isn't really stretching the boundaries of imagination. Although, Esther moving up and down between the first and second story of the saloon might have been the foundation to a core mechanic if all the other attacks somehow related. But they don't, okay? They don't. So if nothing relates, what if the core mechanic is that nothing relates? This sounds silly, but it has the semblance of a mechanic. With all these distinct game elements which are the result of surrealist brain dumping, maybe the mechanic becomes, there's so much stuff coming at you, you just gotta figure out where it isn't. Voila! We just invented Area-Confinement. Area-Confinement is what you get when you combine multiple area denial elements, and area denial elements are really just anything that limit the playable space. Area denial elements can take many forms, such as pits of doom or big fireballs. Another such form is as a giant bright green cactus.
No, not the cactus!
But that's not all. Once we start to map out Esther's attacks, as well as Esther herself, we develop a pretty convincing area denial map. All of Esther's hostile elements contribute to this map. Let's look. As the largest area denial element, Esther in the saloon takes up roughly 2/5 of the screen. This area remains locked for the duration of the fight. Although she does change shape, Esther never gives up this area. Next, the snake oil. Let's break it down into 2 parts. For the first part of the attack, the snake oil shoots from Esther, covering about 3/5 or 2/3 of the screen while arcing vertically. Strangely, the oil can extend out to wildly different distances, which is a problem we'll save for later. This box now represents a no-go area. This area has been denied. While it's generally safe to move inside this area while Esther is performing her lasso cactus attack, there's little benefit in moving closer to Esther, and since there's no reason for the player to take that risk, this is a soft area denial. It's not as hard of a denial as a Pit of Doom or Esther herself, but it's close. The second part of the snake oil, where both snakes wiggle across the screen, is sadly a joke and an insane waste of potential, and thus an insignificant presence in terms of area denial. We'll discuss why soon. Looking at our map so far, it seems that the player would simply avoid the right side of the screen, but we're not done yet. Cactus time! Plain and simple, the giant cactus takes up half the screen on either the top half or bottom half, wherever Esther resides. The cactus is a massive area denial attack that really constrains the player's playable space. Since it can be on either the top or bottom, this is soft area denial. Next, the Vulture Dynamite duo. The Vulture is simple. Every 10 seconds, it flies across the very top screen. Since it appears often, we're just going to mark that area as a soft denial. There's no player benefit in going up there and taking that risk, so it's a no-go. When the dynamite bundle hits the ground, it explodes in 2 waves. This is a fanning projectile. The defining trait of fanning projectiles is that the projectiles spread farther apart the farther they get from the origin. That means when the projectile goes off, the player wants to be as far from it as possible since it becomes easier to dodge. There's no real benefit in going toward bottom screen because it increases risk but offers nothing in return. Our last area denial element is the horsefly's projectile. The horsefly's projectile acts similarly to the fanning dynamite. The farther the player is from the source of the projectile at left screen, the more time the player has to avoid it, so the easier it is to avoid. Since the horsefly projectiles always originate at left screen, we'll mark it as a smaller gradient originating from the left. And that's our area denial map. One thing that you might immediately notice is this little patch here. This bare patch doesn't have any hard denial areas. This area is pretty much safe. Well, maybe safe isn't the correct word. This area is relatively low risk. At first, you might think this is a good thing. Finding the safe zone becomes a core skill. There's only one problem. That safe zone never changes. Once the player finds it, the gameplay potential of that theoretical core skill is exhausted. So there's a clear optimal strategy here. The player stays in that safe zone for the entire duration of Phase 1. But wait, what about the other attacks? The falling dynamite, the horsefly, and the slithering snakes. Do they force you out of the safe zone? No. These attacks still force the player to move every now and then, but the player doesn't need to leave the safe zone to do so. These attacks are surprisingly a non-factor. The slithering snakes hilariously don't give a flying hoot about you because if the player stays at a constant elevation, as they do in the safe zone, the snakes move around them. Next, the destructible horseflies can largely be dealt with by using Miss Chalice's wide shot, and the spiky balls by shifting slightly to the left or right. Another hilarious feature of the safe zone is that, despite the horsefly area denial zone from earlier, the horseflies actually become easier to dodge when the player sits on the left side. And lastly, we occasionally also shift to avoid the exploding dynamite sticks, but not as often as you'd think because, surprisingly, the Vulture doesn't care where Cuphead is when throwing the dynamite bundle. The thrown dynamite bundle does not actually track where Cuphead is. So overall, the player stays in that safe zone for the entire duration of Phase 1, occasionally moving left and right to avoid the spiky balls and dynamite. And in that safe zone, the snake oil, lasso cactus, and vulture are completely non-existent attacks, which is just utterly astounding. But it also means, if we break this down into player verbs, or the actual actions a player takes, the fight is reduced to 2 things. Hold the attack button, move left and right slightly. That's it. That's all a player does. By using area confinement, Studio MDHR actually reduces possible gameplay. So, while that little bear patch seems innocuous, it actually ruins the entire core mechanic and reduces an absurdly complex phase into a boring and simple snooze fest. Alright, anyways, sorry for dragging you through all that just to say never mind on Esther's area confinement. Area confinement is not a core mechanic. I went through all this because it is important to understand how Esther forsakes one of its most clear-cut, obvious core features. Area confinement was almost a core mechanic, and if Studio MDHR intended it to be, they failed.
Cancelled!
It really is a bummer though, because other base game Cuphead bosses similarly constrain player space, but never as the core mechanic. Dr. Call's robot is the nearest example of dynamically constrained space being the core mechanic. Between the laser, robot arms, creepin' bots, and wall drone, Dr. Call's playable space constantly changes, and the home and missile complements the area denial fairly well. In fact, Dr. Call's robot is probably a better example of area confinement overall, even though it has some of the same problems as High-Noon Hoopla's area confinement. Captain Brinybeard's Shark and Laser are another example of confinement, but both these examples are limited to 1 or 2 phases and can't be core mechanics because of that. High-Noon Hoopla could have taken it a step further, implementing area denial in every phase as the core mechanic, as something special from the DLC. So if we don't have a core mechanic, what do we have? Certainly they did something with all this complexity. Even if there isn't one core mechanic bringing everything together, there's at least got to be some interaction between elements, at least a bit of depth, right? Before we answer that question, real quick detour. If you haven't been following the series so far, you might be wondering why depth is so important. I explore this topic at length in the previous video where we examined Doggone Dogfight, link in the description, so I'll give you the short version here. A game is made up of game elements and their interactions. Depth is what we call the interaction between game elements. Without that interaction, there will be nothing to do in the game and no goal or objective. Depth is a core component, without which a game ceases to be a game and becomes, instead, simply a collection of game elements. Following this logic, a game element which fails to interact with other game elements serves no game function. That element doesn't contribute to gameplay. It doesn't have mechanical significance. Depending on the game, there may be no room for game elements which serve no game function. For example, in Cuphead, we have tightly balanced combat in a small arena with limited screen real estate and a specific art style which demands most of the screen. In addition, game elements constantly vie for limited player attention. The gameplay does not support superfluous elements. The art style does not support superfluous elements. The player themselves does not support superfluous elements. There is no room for game elements which serve no game function. As such, each game element must exist for a purpose. In other words, each game element must be supported by depth. And to take the logic to its conclusion, any game element not supported by depth should not exist. That's depth. Now, back to our question. What about High-Noon Hoopla? Are Esther's Phase 1 attacks supported by depth? In all fairness, yes, Phase 1's attacks satisfy the barest minimum required depth in order for a collection of game elements to be considered a game in the most technical sense of the word. Each attack does, in fact, interact with the player, but they do so in the shallowest way possible. One might think that because the primary function of an attack is to hurt the player, that the most important interaction an attack has is with the player. That seems logical. An enemy attacks the player, then the player either avoids the attack or takes damage. The attack happened, the player expressed a skill to overcome the attack. That's it. There was no other interaction between game elements. The attack served its single purpose. In a game that doesn't tightly constrain the number of elements on screen at a time, or doesn't limit the number of attacks, or doesn't constrain the player to a tiny area, there might be room in the design for an attack that serves one purpose. That game is not Cuphead, because Cuphead is full of constraints. The art style and arena design themselves both impose constraints, and the fact that it's a mastery-based game imposes a zillion more. Cuphead has no room for single-purpose game elements. So let's put this into real terms by looking at the snake oil. First of all, I'm going to change our core assumption. The purpose of an attack is not to hurt the player. The purpose of an attack is to provide the player an opportunity to express a skill. This is important because it changes our perspective on the whole thing. Games exist to be beaten, and players beat games by expressing learned skills. Looking at the snake oil, the first of its two trajectories don't interact with the player in a way that requires skill expression. The player simply has to stay on the leftmost 2/5 of the screen, and the snake oil misses them. That's not a skill. That's just a condition for success. The second trajectory is different, however. The snake oil's second trajectory, the snakes, flies horizontally across the whole screen, and its elevation changes based on the player's position. If the snakes fly on a collision course with the player must maneuver either up or down to avoid them, or maneuver right between them. The snake attack is a simple single-purpose attack requiring a simple skill expression. There's a bit of dynamic interaction with the player, since the player can manipulate the attack's elevation based on their own, but overall it's simple. As is, the snake oil only interacts with the player. But by combining the snake oil with another attack, Studio MDHR could have created depth. And this is where they missed the mark. In the event that the player gets sandwiched between the two projectiles, the player is briefly constrained above and below. This movement constraint increases the player's vulnerability to other coinciding attacks. And there's a bajillion different ways Studio MDHR could have used this. Since the snake oil vertically constrains the player, a separate vertical attack would force the player to avoid that new vertical attack inside a limited space. We kind of see this with the Vulture Dynamite, but the dynamite and the snake oil vertically constraining the player are two events which rarely coincide, so don't really interact. Or, as another option, perhaps the snakes are extended horizontally, so that if the player is caught in between them, another horizontal attack approaches the player in between the snakes. The player is forced to express a skill to avoid the new attack as a punishment for getting caught in a bad position between the two snakes. Or, and here's a wacky idea, maybe the snake oil forms a sort of safe zone, and as long as the player stays inside it, they are immune to other attacks. The player would have to position between the two projectiles and then move horizontally in sync with them to stay in the safe zone. This idea plays into the Area-Confinement mechanic pretty well. These are just a few ideas to turn the single-purpose attack into a multi-purpose attack that creates depth. These ideas differ from the current Phase 1 just by adding interaction between game elements. It greatly saddens me that none of them were realized. All of Phase 1's attacks have the same problem. They're all single-purpose. For the most part, the snake oil, cactus, vulture, and horseflies only interact with the player. However, there is one exception to this. The one attack in the whole phase that creates depth, and it happens to be a rare occurrence.
No, not the cactus!
Let's assume that the safe zone doesn't exist. When Esther lassos the cactus in, it forces the player to the opposite side. The bottom cactus forces the player into the top half, and the top cactus forces the player into the bottom half. On the bottom, wherever the dynamite explodes, it's impossible to dodge, or nearly so, if you're right above the dynamite's impact zone. Therefore, if the dynamite and cactus attacks are both in sync, it's possible for the dynamite to explode right when the player enters that area from the cactus, causing the player to express a slightly different skill than they normally do with the exploding dynamite on the top half. However, the player can react to the lasso telegraph so that the cactus instead pushes the player into safety underneath the fanning dynamite sticks. Or the player may try to predict where the dynamite will land and move away from it to the top or to the side where it's much safer. But a cactus may show up to force the player to rethink their strategy. These extra conditions of, if the player does this, then this happens, or if they do that, this other thing will happen, are a way to tell if you have created engaging scenarios, and they're a consequence of depth. Anytime you see conditions like that popping up, it means the game elements are interacting with each other. So yeah, this one variation on this one attack creates depth, but there are some problems. The first problem is random chance. Each time Esther attacks, she picks between either the snake oil or the cactus. In addition, she moves between the top and bottom floor of the saloon. Logic would suggest that, if you wanted to find the chance that Esther is both upstairs and picks the cactus attack, you would simply multiply the 2 states for the saloon by the 2 states of her attacks, for a total of 4 possible states. Any one state would logically have a 1 in 4 or 25% chance of happening. In my personal testing, this 25% chance doesn't hold up. In my testing, out of 100 attacks, Esther used the cactus from the top floor only 14 times. That's a 14% chance that Esther covers the top half on any one attack. Now, my numbers might be a bit off because when you restart the fight, Esther always attacks first with the snake oil from the top floor. But that's an important point too, because in the average fight, a player might let Esther attack 4 to 6 times before they deal enough damage to advance the phase. And if Esther always attacks first with the snake oil from the top, that's one less possible chance that she uses the cactus on the top floor. After attacking, Esther also usually switches floors, which means her second attack also can't be a cactus on top because she's currently on the bottom. Her third attack may be a cactus on top, but then her fourth attack will most likely be back on the bottom. So in the average fight, a player will likely never see the cactus on top. The random chance is too low. The second problem is that the dynamite and cactus might not even line up in the rare event that the player does see the cactus on top. Given variations in timing, either because the vulture held the dynamite until the end of his flight path, or because Esther fired multiple snake oils in a row, it's definitely not guaranteed the dynamite will go off at the correct time in order to create this engaging scenario. Random chance kills this depth. The whole interaction falls prey to a lack of intent. Instead of using these interactive elements to guarantee depth, Studio MDHR left it up to random chance, which suggests to me that they might not have even known what they created. But that's just speculation, I guess. Alright, so Phase 1 has no depth either. It's looking pretty bleak. So we're still trying to figure out what all these game elements are for. They don't operate around a core mechanic, and they don't interact enough to create deep engaging scenarios. So where did they even come from? We're going to try one last time to fit all these game elements together, and for this attempt, we're going to look at theme. We talked about unifying themes in the last video, but as a quick reminder, multi-phase challenges, like Cuphead, require 2 things in order to form a cohesive picture. They need both a core mechanic and a unifying theme. In simplest terms, a unifying theme is what the boss is about. A boss's theme is the central core idea that ties every phase together into one cohesive experience, and as the absolute central piece of the whole challenge, the theme must be supported by its game elements and mechanics. The theme reinforces the mechanics, and the mechanics reinforce the theme. If this is not the case, your theme is not a unifying theme. We've established that, at best, we have a weak core mechanic. So what about that unifying theme? I'm not gonna leave you in suspense this time. Despite all the game elements being vaguely Western themed, High-Noon Hoopla, as a whole, does not have a unifying theme. We'll touch on unifying theme across the whole fight when we talk about Phase 3, but for now, let's focus specifically on Phase 1. Phase 1 embodies a classic Western theme, specifically an outlaw in a saloon who's wanted dead or alive. Now, this is a really cool setup narratively because we've got an outlaw who's barricaded themselves inside the saloon, and we get this cool shootout scene between Cuphead and Esther. Esther's first attack, the snake oil, reinforces this theme right off the bat because it looks like she's firing a revolver. But that's where it ends. Because as a barricaded suspect, we expect all of Esther's attacks to come from the saloon. That's part of the core dynamic of a saloon shootout. The law is outside and the outlaw is inside. The outlaw is under siege by the law. Instead of reinforcing this dynamic and having all of Esther's attacks originate from the saloon, only 1 out of Esther's 4 attacks actually come from Esther. The rest just kind of fly in from random directions. And the randomness doesn't stop there. The vulture, horsefly, and cactus are only loosely Western themed, let alone outlaw themed. In the context of the outlaw Esther, they just seem random. The Dynamite fits the Western Outlaw theme better, but only sort of the saloon theme, unless we're assuming Esther is robbing the saloon safe. But even then, why is the Dynamite flying out of the sky on a vulture? I mean, come on. Are Esther and the vulture friends? Do they, like, hang out? Are they partners? I don't get it. The vulture seems completely detached from Esther. Unless the vulture is supposed to be foreshadowing the death of the outlaw or something metaphorical like that. But then if the vulture is supposed to be an omen of El Portent, why is it helping Esther? Maybe it's just that the outlaws feed vultures in a grim sort of way? But really, there's no connection there. I'm just making crap up. There's no connection between theme and mechanics. Logic isn't going to help piece it together. This goes back to the pitfall of Surrealism. Surrealism is, by its nature, illogical. But when you combine Surrealism with game mechanics, you have to be careful that the illogicalness of Surrealism doesn't accidentally bleed into your logical mechanics. Contrast the vulture with Captain Brinybeard's shark. They're essentially the same thing thematically. The reason why we think Captain Brinybeard summoning a shark makes sense and a vulture carrying dynamite doesn't is because Captain Brinybeard's theme ties into his mechanics. Brinybeard telegraphs the shark with a whistle, therefore indicating that he has some connection to the ensuing shark. He's master of the seas or something. There is mechanical implementation of theme in the form of a telegraph. The vulture, on the other hand, is completely detached. The horsefly is another disjointed element. As far as I can figure, the horsefly exists as a callback to the fact that horses and flies existed at the same time. Why else was it added? The horsefly enemy is so disconnected from other mechanics that I have to guess Studio MDHR threw it in just to satisfy an arbitrary difficulty goal under the guise of surrealist inspiration. The horseflies sum up surrealism for surrealism's sake. They fail to complement or even recognize the context, theme, and gameplay of their environment. And don't even mention a core mechanic, because these horseflies got nothing to do with that. And the cactus is just a cactus, loosely Western.
No, not the cactus!
In the same way that none of the game elements complement the core mechanic, they also don't complement the theme. Each element exists individually and pays almost no attention to what's around it. I, personally, would have liked to see what Studio MDHR could have come up with if they really focused here, because the Western theme is incredibly robust. Historically, the time period is fascinating. You have this rapid expansion of federal territory in the West, which opens up huge areas of land for people to settle. Then you've got outlaws who come in and prey on those isolated people, using that huge expanse to run away from local law when they catch on.
What now? We get out of here.
Then you've got the railroads and the federal marshals and the privatization of public land, all of which begin to connect those isolated people and squeeze the outlaw into smaller and smaller spaces.
Great.
As the period progresses and the people become interconnected, the outlaw has fewer and fewer safe zones until there's nowhere left to run.
I don't know if you're aware, but this is a civilized land now.
Which, who would have thought, sounds exactly like our core mechanic. There was potential here. Instead, we get a bird, a flying horse, and a plant. Hello everybody, I have an announcement for you folks who made it this far in the video. Designframe is teaming up with Games Over Coffee for game design consulting. This is a very exciting collaborative effort for me because I now get to expand the channel from detailing the design behind the more mainstream titles to helping indie games become the best they can be. If you'd like to submit your game to us, we have a form that you can fill out on our website. If you're a publisher, please reach out via email. And for the rest of you lovely people, if you'd like to watch these consultant videos or have some extra Designframe content in between my videos over here, come on over to the Games Over Coffee Consulting channel. I'll provide links to everything in the description and in the pinned comment. I'll also put up community posts on this channel for new consultant video releases, or at least create a playlist for you, so they'll be available from this channel as well. I'll be keeping transparent on future announcements and updates as well. Alright, back to the video. No core mechanic, too little depth, a theme but not a unifying theme, and a bunch of disparate elements. That's phase 1. And what does it all boil down to? Without a core mechanic or depth, game elements seem random. Without a unifying theme, nothing comes together. So far in this analysis, all we've done is explain something you knew intuitively before watching. Phase 1 is a chaotic mess. But now you know why. Too many game elements, no relation between them, and no clear goal as to how the fight functions. But enough talking about what Phase 1 doesn't do, now we're going to talk about what it does do. Specifically, the bad things, because there's not many good things to talk about. The problem is that without a core mechanic and depth and all that jazz, we don't have a mastery-based challenge. Mastery-based challenges require skills, and skills require all that jazz. Mastery is all about learning. So, in a mastery-based challenge, creating opportunities for players to learn and encouraging skill expression are the design goals. When we don't do that, when we don't provide a good environment for learning, the player must rely on other methods of problem solving, since the game provides problems but not potential skills to overcome them. Instead of player learning and skill expression, we get rote memorization and a tedious problem-solving experience. In other words, we get trial and error. Trial and error is a cyclical method of problem solving where the solver attempts a solution, judges whether that solution brought on the desired effect, and if no, they then try a different solution. In the field of psychology, trial and error is considered a fundamental method of learning. By learning which solutions don't work, the solver narrows the pool of solutions until they find one that does. Note that the process of trial and error does not necessarily require the solver to understand the problem. It is possible, depending on the problem, for the solver to mindlessly pick solutions and see if they work without knowing how or why, especially in a video game where solutions are finite. In this way, trial and error turns into a fallback option for players who don't understand or don't care to understand the problem or even the solutions. While trial and error is always present in a game, since there will always be problems and solutions and the player has to see which one works, designers should avoid the situation where the player is incentivized to mindlessly perform trial and error. Let's look at how that situation arises. Players typically need two things to solve a problem in a game: skills and knowledge. For any given problem, a player may use both, only one, or neither. The neither situation is what we want to avoid. We don't want to create a situation where players can, and are incentivized to, beat a challenge without growing their skills or understanding. When a player beats a challenge in this manner, engagement suffers, and that has all kinds of negative consequences, such as reduced desire to learn skills in the future, a lack of tension and emotional engagement, as well as the eventual possibility where the player stops playing the game because they're not engaged. In the case of a mastery-based game, we have some additional considerations, since the mastery journey is the game. Building skills and understanding is the whole point. So, let's quickly cover fundamentals of mastery and how they can lead to mindless trial and error if improperly supported. A defining factor of Cuphead is challenge. Cuphead is designed to be difficult. Each challenge, or boss, demands a unique set of player skills, without which the player will fail. The player grows these skills through repeat attempts, and each time a player does fail and subsequently retries, they get closer to beating the boss. Once the player exhibits the minimum level of skill required to beat the boss, as determined by the designers, the player has broached the skill floor and is able to move on to the next challenge. This is the foundation of a mastery-based game. If we break this down, we get three fundamental pieces to a mastery-based game. 1. A skill set, or a certain set of skills to meet the challenge. 2. The player's skill expression, or the execution of their skill set. And 3. Failure, as a consequence of not expressing the required level of skill. These three fundamental pieces give both the player and the designer goals. From the player's point of view, their goal is simple. The player must increase their skill to the required level. This should be obvious. From the designer's point of view, however, it's a little less obvious. When designers see failure as a fundamental piece of mastery, they make the assumption that in order for a challenge to be difficult, the player must fail. They then jump the gun and go directly to creating situations that cause failure. The designer's goal becomes making the player fail. And thankfully, more and more players are at least recognizing when this misguided approach is used, such as Blizzard's approach to raids in World of Warcraft.
Blizzard has even said that they judge whether a raid is too hard or easy based off of, like, they want a raid to last more than one reset. Why are you even thinking about that? Why is that even on your radar? And you're designing content around that you're gonna nerf 15 times? That's insane.
Designing for failure is a bad approach because it misses the point of the failure. The failure isn't there to create difficulty. The failure is there to enforce the skill floor. These sound very similar, but there is a difference. The skills requirement is what creates difficulty, not the failure. A player cannot advance until they express the skills required to meet that floor. The player strives to express skills. The player does not strive to not fail. If the player didn't want to fail, they could simply not play the game. So, instead of focusing on making the player fail, we should instead focus on encouraging skill expression. In the previous sections of this video, we established that High-Noon Hoopla's first phase did not do that. Studio MDHR neither cultivated a core mechanic nor created depth, leading to a lack of required skills. In a nutshell, this is why Phase 1 sucks. Without a core mechanic or any depth, the player doesn't have any skills they're supposed to learn. And if the player doesn't have any skills to learn, we've just eliminated one of our 3 fundamental mastery pieces. By taking away the skill set, the player is left without a goal, since their goal was to meet the skill floor. And if the player's goal is no longer to improve their skill, then we've failed the design objective of the whole game. Without skills, the player is left without a meaningful way to progress the challenge. This is where we end up resorting to mindless trial and error. The game presents the player with an unfair, unknowable, or tedious challenge where the typical method of learning skills is either impossible or too tiresome. The player cannot gain greater understanding and cannot foster the skills required to meaningfully interact with the challenge. The only thing left to a player is to start guessing at solutions and memorizing the results. And since player skills and understanding build on top of each other, not having the skills and knowledge prevents further mastery, to the demise of the mastery-based challenge. Alright, back to Cuphead. In High-Noon Hoopla's first phase, 3 of its 4 attacks contain elements of mindless trial and error due to being unfair or unknowable. Those are the Vulture, the Horsefly's projectile, and the Snake Oil. And all 3 of them are unfair for the same reason. Not a single one of the attacks' telegraphs adequately conveyed the nature of the attack, if they even telegraph at all. Quick reminder, a telegraph is a visual, audio, or in some games, tactile cue that tells a player something is about to happen, which they will then have to react to. Failure to telegraph then means the player is given no or inadequate visual, audio, or tactile cues prior to that something happening.
Like I said, just wasting my f***ing time. The game may as well have been like on pause when we got here, and then it said you can go to the next area after 20 minutes.
The most commonly used example of this, and definitely the most bemoaned by gaming communities, is failure to telegraph an attack. Failure to telegraph creates unfair situations in the case when a player is expected to react, like when avoiding an attack, but is not given the information they need to do so. Let's look at an example from From Software's Elden Ring. Despite pausing for a moment and looking like it's about to do something, this Bell Baron Hunter's attack clearly fails to convey its nature. The hunter first plants its feet in a bracing position at the same time that it turns its back toward the player, suggesting the attack may be a parry or some other kind of trap which will punish the player for attacking, and then he just slides. backwards. Yes, the shield is still on its back when it performs this attack. It's not even looking at the player. There is no sense to this motion at all. 1 nanosecond for the knight to slide across the arena backwards. Completely unintuitive telegraph. No forewarning of this sudden and impressive feat of athleticism. Honestly, the real travesty here is that they didn't incorporate this knight's Olympic gold medal in speed skating into his character design. Let's break this down. Could the player reasonably see the incoming threat before being affected by it, and therefore have time to react? Could the player reasonably process what happened after the fact in order to learn and improve their skills? In this case, the resultant damage is very clearly not the player's fault. The player couldn't have had foreknowledge of the threat ahead of time since the visual cue looks nothing like the attack, and therefore the resulting failure punishes the player for nothing and pads the game difficulty. To add insult to injury, the hunter's cloak also conceals its feet, probably intentionally, so the player can't see it dive into them while facing the wrong way. Without information, the player can't express any skills. But that's the first time the knight uses that attack. After experiencing it once, the player will try to learn from that mistake, as is the point of mastery. However, because the visual cue in no way represented the incoming attack, the player might not have even connected the two. They're so logically dissimilar that the cue won't stick in the player's head as related to the attack. It might take several failures before a player connects the telegraph to the attack. But despite this reservation, let's say the player does learn. Maybe not the first time, maybe not the second, or even third or fourth or fifth, but they do eventually learn. They were able to tell what happened, they learned from it, and so they improved their knowledge and understanding. What was the method for doing so? How did the player improve? Was it pattern recognition? Did the knight show the player clues about its incoming attack? Maybe the knight got into a run-in position and so the shield flashed red or something. Or was it just memorization? Was the player forced to connect two disparate elements into a cohesive picture with no assistance from the game? It's basically like asking a player to remember that apples equals oranges. It's illogical. One does not lead to the next. And then on top of that, you tell them to remember grapes equals cantaloupes and bananas equals peaches. So they have to play this memorization game. Except the things they're matching don't logically lead together. This is the end result of mindless trial and error. In unfair situations, player skills mean nothing. The only methods left to a player to improve are either to cheat or to just memorize everything that happens. We see that very clearly in the case of High-Noon Hoopla's Vulture. We established in the visual chaos section that the vulture fails to telegraph. So, same questions as the knight. Could the player reasonably see the incoming threat before being affected by it, and therefore have time to react? Could the player reasonably process what happened after the fact in order to learn and improve their skills? In this case, it's impossible for a player to have reasonable knowledge of the vulture threat before the threat applies. Before the player encounters it, it lies outside their knowledge and control and cannot be avoided by skill. And since it doesn't telegraph, the player will be unable to process why they were punished. This is very clearly unfair trial and error. But what about the intro animation? The vulture initially flies in the background before the boss fight begins, so doesn't that count as the vulture's initial telegraph? Even though there's a telegraph before the fight begins, we're unlikely to notice it because we're instead focused on Esther's intro animation. Additionally, anything in the intro animation cannot be considered useful or reliable information, including telegraphs, for two reasons. For one, sometimes the extra characters in the intro animations are hints at future phases, so any intro animations are, at best, unreliable indicators of current phase expectations. Secondly, why would a telegraph ever occur during the intro animations before the boss begins? If the boss hasn't begun yet, there are no attacks. And if there are no attacks, there are no telegraphs. Even if we could consider the intro animation relevant to the gameplay, the vulture's telegraph, well, isn't actually a telegraph. The vulture flies from the foreground into the background for what is clearly the end of the vulture's attack. Then it's forgotten about entirely for 6 seconds. 6 whole seconds. Then, when it comes back around again, it gives no visual or audio indication of doing so before it arrives. The vulture does not establish permanence. It does not telegraph. And that's not even accounting for the fact that the boss is so crazy and hectic that a player has too many other things to track. But okay, we discovered the vulture through trial and error rather than a proper telegraph. Once we know about the vulture, everything should be hunky-dory, right? Nope. Trial and error doesn't end once you discover it. Just like the night, we have now been forced into a memorization game.
Oh, I can't believe the vulture got me.
Hit the lasso straight up top. You see this?
After the first encounter, the only way for a player to anticipate the vulture's presence is by counting 10-second intervals and remembering to stay out of top screen. And if a player has a lapse in memory and gets hit by that vulture, they've been punished, not for failure to express a skill, but for failure to memorize.
Oh, I can't believe the vulture got me.
That's not the point of a mastery-based game, and it is inexcusable here. The snake oil is at least a step up from the vulture in that it does actually telegraph, but at the same time, it still doesn't do it well. The snake oil's trajectory, like our Elden Ring example, fails to convey the nature of its attack. What is conveyed when Esther winds up this attack? Firstly, we clearly see Esther spinning the oil jugs like pistols. This clearly conveys horizontal motion, but what most players are likely hit by is not the horizontal motion, but the vertical arc. Despite the attack conveying only horizontal motion, we get an attack that can span nearly the entire vertical space.
Oh my god, really?
I could be wrong on this, but what I think they were going for was some sort of absurdist subversion of expectations, using the spinning motion of the jugs to add backspin to the shot, similar to how a ball returns to you if you throw it with a backspin. However, this doesn't really come through in the animation. The shot curves a ridiculously unintuitive amount, similar to how Calamaria's fish can catch you off guard when it flies way further than expected. And since it's unintuitive, it needs to be memorized. It's not as bad as the vulture and horsefly, but it's still pretty bad. The horsefly's projectile is another unfair attack that barely telegraphs. The spiky ball telegraph is contained mostly within the horsefly silhouette, meaning it gets lost under all the other busyness of the phase. And with no sound effect, the horsefly projectiles are extremely difficult to notice.
Oh, what hit me?
The horseflies and their spiky balls, a sentence I don't ever want to say again, they don't have a sufficient telegraph, thus the player must memorize that they always launch their projectile when they reach the far side of the screen. The player must therefore track the horseflies' progress across screen, or else they'll completely miss the projectile. It's not all doom and gloom, however. The last two attacks, the Dynamite and Cactus, do have sufficient telegraphs. The Dynamite bundle has a sufficient telegraph because the vulture clearly holds it and tosses it. Then, it's reasonable to assume that the Dynamite might blow up on the ground due to affordance, so the resulting Dynamite shards are also sufficiently telegraphed. The Cactus is also sufficiently telegraphed for the same reason of affordance, despite potentially being misleading. It's reasonable to assume that the lasso is pulling a harmful object from the left side once the player understands what the lasso is and where it's going in the visual chaos. So overall, the Cactus and Dynamite are sufficiently telegraphed, but the telegraphs for the vulture, the snake oil, and the horsefly spiky ball are either insufficient or non-existent. That means roughly half of Phase 1 falls under trial and error and memorization, which is why we end up with a half-baked area-confinement mechanic. Half of the phase doesn't encourage skill expression, so players just have to memorize where stuff is. The goal should instead be pattern recognition, but pattern recognition requires the pattern or attack to be visually intuitive, something that the player can respond to by feel. This is impossible to achieve with poor telegraphing. And since many of Esther's Phase 1 attacks don't telegraph well enough to support pattern recognition, let alone to encourage skill growth, the whole phase collapses into tedious trial and error and a visual nightmare, with the only effective skill being rote memorization. Pattern recognition is the crux of real-time skill-based games. When telegraphs are done well, players can envision an expected profile or layout of the challenge in their minds, so when they mess up, they'll understand how and why it's their fault. And by understanding the how and why, they will have made progress toward beating the challenge and will have improved their skills in the process, including pattern recognition. If implemented correctly, every piece of a challenge not only props up, but complements each other. So, the end result of trial and error is unfair, tedious gameplay where player skills mean little. In Phase 1, we get trial and error because we have no skills. We have no skills because we have no depth. We also have no core mechanic because we have no depth. We have no unifying theme because we have no depth. Huh, seems like we needed some depth. Aww. Despite being mechanically different, Phases 1 and 2 produce a similar gameplay loop. The player must navigate a field of assorted flying objects, each of which deals damage. Unlike Phase 1, however, the second phase's attacks are organized into two distinct groups so as to not overwhelm the player. To further control the mental burden, both groups also contain only 2 attacks each. In addition to that, the phase alternates between the groups, so they don't overlap and thereby put too many unique game elements on the screen at one time. Already, we see Phase 2 treating complexity with the reverence it deserves. Let's break down those game elements to see how this phase functions. In the first attack group, we have 2 hostile game elements, the various money objects and Esther's vacuum. The 2 attacks work in conjunction. First, Esther pulls out her vacuum and begins sucking the money projectiles toward her from the left, top, and bottom sides of the screen. The player dodges these by moving around the screen, but they must do so while also resisting the pull of the vacuum, which applies constant force to the player as well as to the money objects. In combination, these 2 attacks force the player to maintain constant input on the movement controls, similar to Ribby and Croaks' fan attack, but way more interesting. Moving to the second group, Esther switches the vacuum from suck to blow, and begins raining big ol' safe deposit boxes on the edges of the screen, acting as walls. The safes also explode once they hit the ground, dispersing additional money objects which aim toward the player. Crucially, this attack also generates depth, where the safes confine the playable area so the money objects have a higher chance of hitting the player. It's a pretty simple attack group, and the skills required to dodge aren't quite as compelling as the vacuum pull, but it's sufficient to pair well with the first vacuum attack group. The variety between the 2 attack groups keeps player interest, and this pairing is certainly a lot better than combining both groups into one big convoluted mess. Both attack groups establish a hectic challenge that keeps the player moving, similar to the chaotic Phase 1, but in almost every respect way better. Despite Studio MDHR intentionally making Phase 2 an assortment of random flying objects, it is, ironically, much simpler and easier to parse than Phase 1, and that simplicity makes a huge difference. As we've talked about, Phase 1 suffers from a fundamental misunderstanding of mastery-based challenges, which leads to overloaded complexity with no purpose. Phase 1 has too many game elements, and all those game elements create a huge visual mess. Phases 1 and 2 share the same hectic feeling, with many elements flying every which way, so it seems logical that Phase 2 would fall into the same visual clarity mess as Phase 1. Does it?
I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, Phase 2. Cool. There's so much happening on screen. I don't know what to do.
To start, Phase 2 has the same visual contrast issue as Phase 1. Actually, it's probably worse, since all of the individual money objects share the same colors as the background. It's very difficult for a player to separate the relevant game elements from the rest of the busyness.
This is one of those levels where, like, I'm not really looking at anything to try and dodge it.
Yeah. Our time is crying. See, like, I don't even know what just got me at all.
Where do you look? Where do you look?
I don't know.
Okay, so I'm just gonna dodge. Good background, man.
This issue could have been easily solved by just desaturating the background or applying a hue change after the frames were digitized, so there's really no excuse. This issue persists across all 4 phases, so this will be the last time I mention it. Just know that it is and will continue to be a significant problem. But that's it. That's Phase 2's biggest contributor to visual chaos, and honestly its biggest problem. But wait a second, how can Phase 2's lack of visual clarity be its only source of visual chaos? Phase 2 has relatively high complexity since there are 4 attacks in total with a bunch of small flying objects, movement manipulation, area confinement, and more small flying objects. With the number of small objects on screen, in conjunction with the heavy game elements of influence in both the player's movement and playable space, how does Phase 2 stay coherent and allow the player to stay focused while progressing along a satisfying learning curve? For one, Phase 2 manages complexity well. A player can only focus on so many game elements at one time. The greater number of relevant game elements there are on screen at one time, the more the player's attention will be split. In Phase 1, the player's attention was split across the entire screen all the time. This certainly didn't help the visual clarity issues. In Phase 2, the attacks are metered. There are only ever 2 attacks on screen at a time to create a simpler and more focused experience. And surprisingly, each of the elements has a purpose. Wow, it's so much easier for the player to stay attentive. Secondly, Phase 2's attacks complement each other. Therefore, it's easier for the player to understand what the goal is and to learn which skills they need to improve on and express. The player can easily determine what's going on and thus stay focused and minimize frustration. We'll talk more about depth in a moment. The third reason why Phase 2 is coherent and allows players to focus and intuitively learn is because Esther herself is the focus. Esther is the source of the attacks. Her vacuum is one big continual field effect that clearly spawns obstacles from the opposite side, which places the player's attention around that left side zone. Even though the money objects are separate from Esther, it's clear that Esther is the cause. The player is able to trace Esther's actions into a coherent series of events, which creates a very intuitive gameplay flow and maintains clear visual coherency. Esther then shoots safes into the air, which again intuitively shifts the player focus to the top of the screen. The safes fall down, then trigger their own attack. Each one of these attacks ultimately derives from Esther herself. Compare that to Phase 1. The vultures, dynamite, horseflies, and spiky balls are all just random stuff disjointed from Esther, and we all know how that turned out. So, the player is able to view Esther as the source of danger and successfully manipulates the relevance of certain screen areas. Your eyes and attention instinctively move to where they need to be. How did they do this? The Telegraph. Watch Esther's Telegraph closely. When she turns on her vacuum, the visual cue tells the player a ton of information, namely that it is, in fact, a vacuum and logically will start sucking things up. Additionally, the visual effect of the saloon getting sucked up indicates the nature of the attack pretty clearly. And even if the player does miss that detail due to the fight's overall clarity issues, it doesn't matter because the high contrast dust cloud communicates the effect in an in-your-face sort of way, which is good for a telegraph that could be very confusing. The visual cue also, mostly, tells the player the direction they should focus on, and it directs the player's attention away from Esther and toward the projectiles. During this whole attack, the player never has to look at Esther, which is important because so many objects fly toward the player from the opposite side of the screen. If the phase was designed so that the player had to focus on both Esther as well as the money objects, the player would likely be overwhelmed. They wouldn't be able to focus on the area of the screen where their attention is most needed. However, I do say the vacuum mostly tells the player where to look because the saloon slurp animation makes it look like Esther is sucking up things behind her, but this is my main issue with the Telegraph. That and how quickly the money objects start showing up, which they do while Esther is still sucking up the saloon before the phase and Telegraph actually begin. Dyson's Never Loses Suction's got nothing on this. If Studio MDHR had lined up this Telegraph better with the start of the money objects, this Telegraph would be pretty good. Already, just from this single attack, Phase 2 feels way more intuitive than Phase 1's random attacks. For the second attack group, the safe drop is an even better telegraph. Esther very clearly starts firing safes into the air, and logically, the player should know they'll come back down. However, there is one problem with this attack. There is no way for the player to reasonably expect the safes will explode into money objects on impact.
What? Oh, the gold's coming out.
As such, that part of the attack would constitute trial and error, but this is a minor issue since Phase 2 has only one instance of trial and error as opposed to Phase 1's 3. Up to this point in the fight, the vacuum has been our greatest source of depth. Let's look at how it creates it. The primary source of depth comes from how the attacks are grouped. Remember our two groups, the suck and the blow. The suck group has the vacuum pull and the money objects, and the blow group has the safe drop and the exploding money. Each group's respective two attacks complement each other, which helps both the suck and blow attack groups to appear distinct. In the suck group, the vacuum pull serves multiple purposes. It acts as a strong telegraph for the money objects, but it also affects the player. Crucially, the vacuum serves another purpose. Just either element on its own, the vacuum pull or the money objects, would be pretty boring. But because the pull makes it harder for the player to dodge the money objects, the two build off each other. In other words, game elements interact, so we get depth. Note how Esther doesn't pull out another object like a magnet in order to pull the player around. Instead, she uses a single, thematically integrated element to expand on an existing attack. The vacuum works with the outlaw theme and also has mechanical significance. The vacuum also features for the entire phase. It's not just a one-off thing. It has presence throughout, and that presence promotes continuity. Compare this to Phase 1's all the things all at once approach, where each element serves one single purpose and none of them interact. Each element appears and then disappears and is thematically disconnected. In the blow group, the depth comes from the safes confining the playable area so the money objects have a higher chance of hitting the player. On its own, this attack group is uninteresting and would make for a forgettable phase, but because its depth is at least sufficient and its theme in line with the Western Outlaw theme, it pairs well with the vacuum suck group. The variety between the two attack groups keeps player interest. Organizing individual attacks into groups is a clever way to make each attack interact with other elements, but there's also an added bonus. Since each of Esther's Phase 2 attacks tie to the vacuum, and the vacuum ties to Esther's outlaw theme, that makes each of Esther's attacks also tie to her outlaw theme. And since every element now ties to the theme, we don't end up with random dynamite slinging birds. Unfortunately, this level of thematic integration isn't seen again. Aside from Esther's snake oil guns, the Western Outlaw theme applies almost exclusively to Phase 2. The vacuum, as Phase 2's pinnacle thematic element, is more thematically involved than the whole of Phase 1. And since Phase 1 barely establishes any thematic elements, nothing carries over between phases. Despite Phase 2 having pretty good thematic integration, it gets none of it from the prior phase, and that's a significant structural problem. There's no continuity between phases. Phase 2 is not a satisfying continuation of Phase 1, nor does it continue to be fleshed out in Phase 3. The phase isn't part of any greater core mechanic or central unifying theme. And with no guiding theme, we throw away the outlaw after only barely scratching the surface. So, even though Phase 2 appears pretty good on paper, this simple yet effective phase fails to collaborate with the rest of the challenge, which is far more important. On to the next isolated surrealist brain dump, Phase 3. Cuphead often struggles to fill 3 phases with coherent and integrated mechanics. So it's no surprise that High-Noon Hoopla starts to break down by Phase 3. Similar to Phase 2, Phase 3 shamelessly ignores everything the previous phase introduced. Its weak gameplay borders on transition phase levels of tedium, and it offers nothing new or engaging, aside from its goofy presentation. Oh yes, we'll get to that hilarious presentation, but first things first, the gameplay. As usual, Esther sits at right screen, alternating between her top and bottom positions and switching between her flying and running animations. The player must alternate with her to stay on target. Phase 3 contains 2 attacks, stakes and cans of beans. The stakes fly in a circular pattern and angle toward the player shortly after firing. The cans of beans maintain a static vertical position as they move from right screen to left screen, and they also extend little vertical bean chains as they go. Despite seeming random, the cans actually follow a strict pattern. 4 cans spawn in order from bottom to top, then 4 spawn from top to bottom. Both the cans and the stake, of course, force players to dodge and move around whilst trying to maintain aim on the boss. But while it may seem like an important aspect of Phase 3, Esther's position on screen largely does not matter. Whether Esther is on the top half or the bottom half, the gameplay remains the same. The cans of beans spawn across the screen equally, and the player's approach to dodging them doesn't change based on the boss's positioning. The player dodges the same bean cans in the exact same way whether they're on the top or bottom. Similarly, the stakes always head toward the player's general vicinity no matter what, and the player's approach to dodging them doesn't change based on the boss's positioning. The player dodges the same stakes in the exact same way whether they're on the top or bottom. Esther's elevation doesn't change that. The only time Esther's position matters is when she is actively moving, but even then only for the brief moment the player is off target. And the effect of taking the player off target is not skill expression, as should be the goal, but artificial difficulty, since the player deals less consistent damage and therefore spends more time in the phase and must dodge more objects. And when offered 2 options, the player will always choose to spend more time in the phase as opposed to making a risky maneuver to stay on target. Making a maneuver that could mean failure in exchange for dealing more consistent damage is not a rational decision because there is little reward for staying on target. A couple seconds saved staying on target compared to the minute and a half required to get back to Phase 3 upon failure. Players should almost always be expected to take the path of least resistance because the vast majority of them will. In all other cases except these brief windows, Esther's elevation is redundant. She could be stationary in the middle of the screen and nothing would change. Not a single thing. At least Phase 1 almost took advantage of Esther shifting between the top and bottom halves. Her shifting elevations, combined with her cactus attack, could have created opportunities that forced players to deal with coinciding attacks differently, as we've already discussed. For example, if her cactus extends across the top half, then we dodge her dynamite attack by moving beside where it hits the ground. If her cactus instead extends through the bottom half, then we dodge her dynamite by maneuvering between individual dynamite shards. This potential depth between attacks demonstrates how Esther's different elevations and use of space was on the right track and could have had engaging depth with just a little extra push. Looking at the whole fight, changes in elevation could have even been part of the boss's core mechanic. Phase 1 employs area confinement as well as 2 alternating elevations. Those are 2 mechanics that could carry an entire boss. The 2 attack groups from Phase 2 also alternate between elevations. Including the 3rd phase, that's 3 out of 4 phases that use the elevations but don't really do anything with them. What's the point? So much could be done with this mechanic which already exists in the game as a functional element, and it was ignored. Why implement it if it's not going to be used? To make Phase 3 even worse, the stakes and beans don't interact with each other. And with those being the only 2 attacks, as well as 1 completely unused elevation game element, that's a total of 0 game elements interacting. No depth. Phase 3 consists of only a couple shallow attacks and a redundant elevation system. It's a wonder it was included in the game at all, let alone somehow made it past conception. Now, for what you've all been waiting for, the first and most prominent aspect of Phase 3, the food transformation. Phase 3 begins with Esther's transformation into sausages. First of all, yes, it's both unexpected and hilarious.
Oh, Acme Cooker. He's a sausage! Oh my god.
Sausage? Oh my god! It's sausages!
Hey.
Yes?
What do you... I'll tell you next time you're there.
No.
What do you call a cow that uses magic?
Cow? What do you? What do you?
We gotta wait.
What, dude?
Oh, you died. No, but the stakes were so high.
What? What happened to the vacuum? I hope we got protection plan on that. That bitch is sausage now.
Okay, ready? What do you call a cow that does magic?
I don't know what. Tell me now. Tell me now.
A sausage. I'm so dead.
But the hilarity doesn't excuse the disconnect in theme. Phase 1 introduces the outlaw theme with the saloon and snake oil guns, but it ultimately fails to do anything with it. Phase 2 takes the outlaw theme further by integrating it into each of Esther's attacks. But then we get to Phase 3 and encounter a neck-snapping whiplash.
Oh! Shoot! Oh! Oh! Oh!
Halfway through the fight, we change themes completely. I mean, okay, sure, cattle rustling is a thing. Outlaws steal cows and cows equal food. Sure, got it, but did cattle rustling ever come up? In Phase 1, our biggest tie to the outlaw is the snake oil. For those that don't know, the West was plagued by traveling salesmen that would sell useless or even dangerous medicines marketed as miracle cures. They would then skip town before anyone figured out that the medicine wasn't real, taking their ill-gotten gains with them. Due to the size of the West and how little communication there was between towns and how easy it was to make up a fake name, these lying salesmen moved from place to place before news could get ahead of them. People called the medicine they sold snake oil. Okay, so yeah, selling snake oil is a thing outlaws did. Got it. Esther also treats the snake oil jugs as pistols. Pistols are the most obvious tie-in to an outlaw theme, but a clever addition nonetheless. In Phase 2, our outlaw starts stealing money with a vacuum. That's easy to understand. Outlaws like stealing money. Got that one too. But then in Phase 3, I guess we're now a meat? And that's related because Esther is a cow girl? Which we never did anything with in the first place. It's weak. When did we ever truly explore the Western outlaw theme? The new theme of the cow turning into food is clearly not focused on Esther as an outlaw and only vaguely Western themed from the canned beans and sausages. But even a vaguely Western themed fight would have been fine if they didn't convolute it with so many random things. It's like they got a notepad out and just started listing things that exist in the West without considering what any of them mean. And we all know that's exactly what Studio MDHR did, and that's a huge mistake. There was enough here already. We didn't need a whole other theme of food transformation that we're not going to do anything with anyways. If Studio MDHR simply focused on the Western theme, we wouldn't get this random whiplash where we abandon everything that came before, both thematically and mechanically. Maybe if the shift had a purpose, I could excuse the whiplash. Maybe the shift could have been foreshadowed, again by bringing the historical context in. Esther the outlaw gets thwarted at every turn, and gradually gets pushed into a smaller and smaller space, until she becomes a packaged meat. And even if there is some narrative here that I'm missing, there at least needs to be mechanical connections between the phases. We need our key learning points we talked about in the last Cuphead video. We need a core mechanic to carry everything through. We just don't get that with the meat. It feels like two completely separate fights. Esther's unifying theme could have been either her Western outlaw theme or her food transformation theme. Or if the two were carefully combined in their historical context, a fusion of both might have worked. Instead, we get the most random assortment of themes and a reckless, short-sighted use of surrealism. Now, for a quick detour to talk about surrealism, because it's perhaps the most misunderstood concept behind Cuphead's ideology. Surrealism is not an excuse for disjointed themes and random mechanics. A common pitfall of surrealism is thinking it's nothing more than an artistic expression composed of illogical cartoon randomness, which can be anything it wants to be and, therefore, can be excused as nothing at all. In other words, people fall into the trap that because surrealism is illogical by nature, it can just be random for random's sake. Now, I'm not here to debate the nature of art, but when applying art toward practical purposes, like making video games, the art needs to conform to the practical design intent. And in the case of Cuphead, we have a very specific design intent. If we use surrealism just for the sake of randomness, we'll end up with an unstructured and unsatisfying fight. A fight about nothing doesn't jive with Cuphead's design intent. I hope that's clear so far in this series. However, even though we have strict practical design constraints, the illogical nature of surrealism, wherein anything can happen as long as it's an expression of self, can be used to great thematic and aesthetic effect. It can be used to great effect as long as that surrealism complements an already established unifying core theme. That's the pitfall which most of Cuphead's bosses fall into. With so much random, there needs to be a common connection point so we can turn that randomness into game mechanics. Because while surrealism can be random, game mechanics can't. If they are, they'll be unlearnable and unsatisfying. For High-Noon Hoopla, it's easy to see its presentation in the second half and be enthralled by the wacky surrealism.
Acme Cooker. He's sussing! Oh my god.
But that experience is only surface level. What is the surrealism built on top of? The Western theme that Esther weakly attempted for a couple phases before abandoning? The Outlaw theme, specific enough to be a foundation for a boss but only used in one phase? Or maybe the food transformation theme from cow to sausages to packaged meat? The food theme is the one players remember in which surrealism supports extremely well. But in that case, why does this real theme only constitute half of a lengthy 4 phases? The unfortunate truth is that mishandled surrealism killed this fight before it began. We have 2 only somewhat related themes, and since the themes don't build off each other, neither do the mechanics. And since the food theme is the primary theme, the boss doesn't start until halfway through the fight. Instead of establishing a solid core theme and building upon it with surrealism, Esther implements as many phases as possible with as many game elements as it could fit on the screen, and then stumbles through them as incoherently as possible.
Let's be franks here, I'm your worst nightmare.
Rounding out the fight, Esther introduces the best phase of the whole thing, Phase 4. Phase 4 is by far the simplest and least chaotic phase, which is a welcome change after the last 3. By cutting out all of the superfluous game elements and wild visual clutter, Phase 4 is able to focus solely on one central gameplay loop. This gameplay loop is also the closest thing High-Noon Hoopla has to a core mechanic. Let's take a look. In Phase 4, Esther transitions into her final form, a can of sausages. Emerging from the can are 2 sausage chains that move up and down and have gaps for the player to weave between. The player must maneuver around these while also dodging a fanning projectile attack of flaming hot peppers. The arena-wide hazard of sausage chains not only keeps the player moving, but also makes them analyze when and where to move, which is our gameplay loop. If we break down the player actions here, we see something surprising. Moving up and down between the sausage chains feels a lot like moving up and down between Esther's top and bottom elevations. And since they're so similar, it's almost as if Esther changing elevation in the first 3 phases was meant as a key learning point for Phase 4's sausages. And since the mechanic of moving up and down is present in all 4 phases, it's the closest thing we have in the whole fight to a core mechanic. I want to be clear though, that this is not a core mechanic. It's just the closest thing we've got. The reason it's not a core mechanic is because, as we've talked about, Esther's elevation is largely insignificant for the first 3 phases. It gets a brief mention for Phase 1's Cactus Dynamite combo, but that's it. If the core mechanic is only used for 1 out of 4 phases, then it's not really the core mechanic. But it could have been. It could have been. Anyways, Phase 4 is not particularly deep, which we can blame on the lack of key learning points, but that's mostly okay. Its gameplay loop is the perfect finale for a boss because it's easy to learn, but intense. Still requires thought, but thankfully not reliant on chaos or randomness. The simple conclusion creates anticipation for the player as they near the finish line. Any additional game elements would throw unneeded complexity into the mix and ruin this ideal photo finish. With more game elements comes the potential for tedium, as the player may excessively repeat the entire boss just to practice belated learning points. Instead, Phase 4 focuses on a solid, tight gameplay loop and allows players to engage with an intuitive but still tough last phase. Since Phase 4 has fewer game elements, it suffers less from the visual chaos. Similar to Phase 2, Phase 4 only uses 2 attacks at a time. In fact, the concept behind Phase 4's attacks is basically the same as Phase 2. You have 2 attacks, one of which is a primary attack, and one which is a secondary attack and which creates conflict with the first. In Phase 2, the money objects were the primary attack and the vacuum was the secondary attack. The vacuum was not dangerous on its own, but it did change how the player interacted with the primary threat. In Phase 4, we have the same dynamic. The sausage chains are the primary attack. They're what force the player to move around the arena. But then we also have the flaming hot peppers, which change how the player has to move. The player can't focus only on the sausage chains because the peppers conflict with the maneuvers required to dodge those sausages. And the player must anticipate where those peppers will be when it comes to dodge, or they might get boxed in. This 1-2 combo of primary attack, secondary attack is an incredibly effective way to keep the number of game elements to a minimum while still creating depth. I know I said I wouldn't talk about this again, but I am. Phase 4 also has the highest contrast between foreground elements and the move and background, so many of those visual issues are alleviated if not resolved. Studio MDHR also recognized a potential exploit and made an attempt to fix it. It's possible to position Cuphead above Esther and rain bombs on her from above while remaining outside of the sausage area. Studio MDHR attempted to remove this exploit by making a can of beans spawn in that would force the player off that spot. This was in staying with their design intent to create mastery-based challenges. Players cannot circumvent the challenge. This exploit prevention is very similar to what was done in Jimmy the Great's Phase 3 when the puppet pulls out his finger gun. Unfortunately, Esther's exploit is not completely eradicated. Vinny managed to cheat Phase 4 without the can of beans spawning in. I was able to replicate what Vinny did, and the game did not stop me from doing so, which defeats the entire purpose of the beans, and honestly just short-circuits the whole phase. It's really cheesy. This situation leads me to believe that Studio MDHR's fix wasn't fully tested. Regardless, the idea was on the right track, and Phase 4 as a whole is genuinely solid and well designed. Overall, Esther Winchester leads me to ask the hard-hitting questions. Are the DLC bosses just a compilation of random ideas thrown into a melting pot with no real through line or structure? For the most part, yeah. Esther Winchester is yet another boss without proper thematic or gameplay structure. We've touched on structure and tedium a bit, but let's do a quick holistic view of the fight through the lens of our 4 guidelines to gameplay structure, which I introduced in the previous video. Last episode on the Howling Aces, we talked extensively about the guidelines and principles that give structure to multi-phase challenges, like those in Cuphead. I won't be going into the same details in this video, but you'll still be able to follow along here just fine. I'll link the video at the end if you want to learn more about the design theory behind these guidelines. The structure of a boss as a whole is just as important as any singular element. Structure can single-handedly make or break a challenge. It can either encourage cohesion with a climactic finish, or it can fall into tedium. Structure and structural issues can only be evaluated when looking at every piece of a challenge combined. Let's look. The first structural guideline, Upfront Complexity, means that the most complex aspects of a multi-phase challenge are placed at or near its beginning. This means that the highest concentration of game elements, therefore the largest possibility space, is placed where players spend the most time. In Cuphead, this is Phase 1. In other words, Phase 1 should take the longest to learn and master because players spend the most time on it. To be clear, it's perfectly fine for a boss or multi-phase challenge to not have a phase with much higher complexity than the rest. In that case, the guideline of upfront complexity doesn't apply. But it certainly does apply for Esther. For upfront complexity, it's no surprise where High-Noon Hoopla sits. Phase 1's 4 attacks, each of which is comprised of several game elements, exhibit an absurd level of complexity over top extreme visual overload. While Phase 1 clearly brings too much complexity, its high complexity is at least in the right place. I'll call a spade, but I'll also give credit where credit's due. And that certainly extends to the next structural guideline, late simplicity. Late simplicity means ordering our game elements so that the last part of a challenge is simple. Simple meaning relatively less complex. Put the simple things at the end, the section of a challenge that the player will spend the least time playing. Additionally, with less complexity in the later phases, there's more room for escalating depth and difficulty. This creates the ideal scenario of the climactic ending, which, thankfully, we see very clearly with Esther. Esther applies late simplicity perfectly. Phase 4 is consistently engaging to play and satisfying to finish, yet it's simple. Through its simplicity, Phase 4 was able to escalate its difficulty for that photo finish. Also through its simplicity, Phase 4 avoids the tedious scenario of replaying already mastered content for the purpose of learning the final phase. Instead, the player may fail the 4th phase maybe a few times and cross that finish line before the past phases wear them down. That said, due to the lack of a unifying theme and core mechanic, we don't get a lot of narrative action here. It doesn't feel like the player undertook a satisfying mastery journey, since game elements are just tossed together, and there's no theme to pull all our disparate threads together. All those narrative elements, like our outlaw Esther stealing from the saloon, are left as loose ends. While High-Noon Hoopla does incorporate upfront complexity and late simplicity, the rest of its structure falls apart. The next structural guideline is early key learning. A boss with early key learning points is one that introduces a mechanic or concept in a limited capacity, either with less depth and/or easier difficulty, so that the player can learn and practice that mechanic before the mechanic evolves. Early key learning points lay the foundation for depth, and in doing so, encourage mastery and decrease tedium. Remember how a multi-phase challenge requires a core mechanic? Again, when there's one core element, the other elements support it. This not only creates depth for that element, but increases the depth of every related element, giving the player new skills to master and decreasing tedium. In a multi-phase challenge, a core mechanic can only function as such if there's early key learning. Unfortunately, Esther simply doesn't introduce any key learning points. Esther could have established Phase 1's Area-Confinement and/or her 2 different elevations as core mechanics. There are countless ideas and directions from those core mechanics that could have fostered depth and mastery potential. Instead, there is minimal depth, and the mastery potential is held back by chaos and tedium. Without depth, there is no satisfying gameplay. There's nothing to justify the complexity. Additionally, without mastery potential, there's also no game. Remember, as we established in our first Cuphead DLC item imbalance video, Cuphead is a mastery-based game. Without mastery, there is no goal, and there is no game. When we put it in such simple terms, it's clear that High-Noon Hoopla harbors a massive underlying design flaw. Without depth or mastery potential, it fails to qualify as a mastery-based challenge, which is the point of the whole game. But let's do our due diligence and briefly cover the rest of the phases. In Phase 2, the closest element resembling a core mechanic is the vacuum's multi-purpose use, specifically how it manipulates our movement by pulling us toward it. This is never expanded on or explored further, so no key learning. Phase 3 almost emphasizes the differing elevations that were first established in Phase 1, but it ended up being a redundant mechanic. Phase 4 is solid, but none of its required skills are taught ahead of time. So in the end, Esther fails to establish depth which evolves over time. There is nothing for the player to learn and master and experiment with. Instead, each phase is isolated and abandons previous mechanics long before they've been even remotely explored. The last structural guideline is early replayability. Replayability is an elusive concept and one that's hard to define, but it's extremely important. If tedium is the surefire way to reduce a player's desire to replay content, then replayability is the opposite. Replayability generally means that repeated attempts or playthroughs will not significantly reduce a player's desire to replay content. Extended challenges rely on the replayability of its systems and mechanics because they're intended to be practiced and repeated until beaten. Cuphead is no different. The player must replay the whole boss from the start until they beat it. And of course, since the player replays the beginning phases of a challenge more than any other phase, naturally those early phases should be the most replayable. Otherwise, most of the boss becomes tedious. The best source of replayability is depth. Phase 1 had the opportunity for depth through its differing elevations and area confinement. With so many various elements, there was potential for lots of skill expressions, whether it had to do with dodging projectiles differently based on where the player was on screen, or interacting with the snake oil, or any of those other ideas. But potential is the key word here. Phase 1 mostly consists of disjointed elements that serve to increase complexity without increasing depth, which is a design failure. Each element is isolated. It does not interact with each other. Phase 1 is only replayable in so much as bashing your head against a wall is replayable. Sure, you can keep doing it until you break through the wall, but it certainly won't be enjoyable, and it won't actually improve the player's skill. It'll actually make them dumber from the brain damage. Or in design terms, the player will feel overwhelmed or mentally burdened. Instead, the player should feel the urge to improve, and in order to improve and increase their skill level, players must stay engaged. Depth is key. Thankfully, Phase 2 contains a little bit of depth in its vacuum's multiple purposes that are both mechanically and thematically engaging. But by then, the damage that Phase 1 caused has not only already run its course, but will continue to do so as players replay Phase 1 over and over as they fail the later phases. The boss's replayability is about as dead as old Bessie here. So why would we ever replay the boss? The primary reason to replay Esther Winchester relies entirely on the crazy narrative twist in the second half. As disjointed as Esther's themes are, phases 3 and 4 at least create a fantastic narrative throughline. The transition from cow to sausages to packaged meat is thematically and narratively unexpected and hilarious.
This is amazing. This is absolutely stunning.
Even then, her food-based theme only applies to half of the boss, with barely any mechanical coherency between phases. Esther is a showcase of too many ideas with not enough content. Bessie's got more meat on her bones than this fight. Overall, Esther Winchester's gameplay structure falls into the trappings of tedium. Phases 1 and 4 properly use upfront complexity and late simplicity, respectively, but with no key learning points and no depth, there's nothing to support mastery. Without mastery, none of the learned skills feel worthwhile. Esther's great use of late simplicity cannot salvage the fight. Bottom line, Esther Winchester might very well be the worst boss of the DLC. From the very beginning, High-Noon Hoopla is a visual blunder. Phase 1 is visually busy and difficult to parse, often resulting in an immediate restart because the player didn't notice something. The visuals remain difficult to parse throughout, between the contrast of the background and foreground in each phase, as well as the shallow and overwhelming abuse of complexity in Phase 1. In addition, High-Noon Hoopla never fleshes out the core Western outlaw theme. As memorable as her food-based theme is, it's the result of abandoning absolutely everything halfway through the boss. Phase 1 abides in chaos, frustrating trial and error, and mechanics that mostly don't complement each other. Due to these issues, High-Noon Hoopla never fully recovers from there on. Despite these shortcomings, Phase 2's vacuum serves multiple purposes very well in the 1-2 combo we talked about. But Phase 2, in the context of the boss as a whole, is not particularly satisfying. There's very little narrative or gameplay coherency between Phases 1, 2, and 3. There's no mechanics carried through the boss, and without mechanical follow-through, we get random elements instead of a cohesive challenge. Phase 2 almost begins to establish thematically integrated mechanics with the whole money-stealing outlaw thing, but all that work is immediately defenestrated in Phase 3. Phase 2 only begins to create something meaningful before devolving back into purposeless nonsense. Phase 2 is more like a good starting point for a boss that just doesn't exist. Phase 3 is then a step down from Phase 2. It has two attacks that both serve the same purpose and don't interact with each other in any meaningful way. Therefore, no depth. Esther's change in elevation between top and bottom also doesn't serve any purpose. If one were to remove the elevation change, the phase would play almost the exact same. Phase 3 is an interesting case study since it contains a lot less complexity and elements than Phase 1, but is somehow just as meaninglessly random and chaotic. Phase 4 is by far the best phase of the boss. It's the perfect type of phase to serve as a satisfying last stretch. A simple yet intense attack that maintains its presence throughout, and without relying on random projectiles to boot. It manages to avoid shallowness by varying the length of the space between the sausage links and using those conflicting elements. Overall, Studio MDHR threw everything at the wall. Game elements, themes, the whole shebang, but then never recognized what actually stuck. Despite the 2 whole core mechanic ideas slipping in unnoticed, core mechanics that could have carried a fight by themselves, Studio MDHR kept pumping out shallow, disconnected elements, thinking they were honoring classic cartoons and surrealism, but instead making a mess of it. There's no substance here. So through the veil of Cuphead's presentation, I got one question, partner. Well, where's the beef? Because I'm not seeing it right now. I'm not seeing any beef. Okay, listen, don't leave quite yet, please. This video is brought to you by you, the viewers, the people who find enough value in this channel to wait patiently for each new release. I am always working on the next big project in between videos alongside my amazing developmental editor and co-author, so I hope the quality is noticeable and I thank you for making it worth the effort. If you're interested, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to be notified of each big release, because ultimately this channel only survives off of people like you who value this kind of rare content on YouTube, and YouTube only likes this kind of content if people keep coming back. Liking the video and commenting also greatly helps the video gain traction, but really just you being here and watching the whole video is the greatest support you can show, so thank you very much. I also can't run this channel without my lovely Patreon supporters. The Design Frame Patreon currently has multiple tiers on a per video basis. I do provide benefits, but I overall want to ensure that if you support the channel monetarily, please do so not for the few benefits here and there, but according to the value you see in this channel. Please also understand that the Patreon is above and beyond, so don't worry if you don't or can't support financially. Take care of yourselves and God bless.
Nice.